close your eyes and listen to the full sleep story on our channel. Sweet dreams. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 1. The windmill beyond the golden fields. The whispering river slowly disappeared behind the rolling hills. Its gentle song faded into the distance. Ahead, golden wheat fields stretched as far as Ethan could see. The breeze moved through them like gentle waves across a peaceful sea. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Every stalk of wheat bowed gracefully with the wind, as though the fields themselves were quietly welcoming every traveler who passed. Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack. Inside rested every quiet treasure gathered along his journey. Each one carried a lesson. Each one carried a memory. None of them made the road shorter. Yet somehow, they made every step lighter. He followed a narrow dirt path between the fields. The warm scent of ripe grain filled the air. Butterflies floated lazily among tiny white wildflowers growing beside the road. Far ahead, a great stone windmill slowly turned beneath the bright blue sky. Its enormous wooden sails moved with calm, steady rhythm. Round and round and round, unlike the lighthouse that shone without resting, or the river that never stopped flowing. The windmill seemed to dance with something invisible. The wind. The closer Ethan walked, the more sounds he noticed. The gentle creak of old timber, the whisper of turning sails, the soft flutter of pigeons circling above the roof. Then, a warm, comforting aroma drifted through the breeze. Fresh bread, warm from the oven. The smell wrapped around him like an old friend. Without realizing it, he smiled. Some sense can remind a heart that everything is going to be all right. At the foot of the hill stood a small stone bakery beside the windmill. Flower boxes overflowed with colorful blossoms beneath every window. Bundles of dried wheat hung beside the wooden door. Above it, a simple wooden sign gently swayed. It read, Hearthwind Mill and Bakery, where every loaf begins with patience. Ethan stepped closer. The old windmill continued its slow, faithful turning overhead. Inside, he heard quiet laughter, the steady rhythm of kneading dough, and the cheerful clink of wooden bowls. He gently knocked. Before he could lower his hand, the door opened. Standing there was a broad-shouldered, elderly man with kind gray eyes. His flour-covered apron looked almost as old as the windmill itself. White flour dusted his beard like fresh snow, yet his smile was brighter than the morning sun. You've walked a long way, the old man said warmly. Ethan smiled. I suppose I have. The baker looked toward Ethan's dusty boots, then toward his backpack. Without asking another question, he stepped aside. Come in. The bread has just finished baking, and no traveler should meet fresh bread from the doorway. The workshop glowed with warm golden light. Fresh loaves rested upon wooden shelves, some round, some long, some sprinkled with oats, others braided with care. The comforting smell filled every corner of the room. Near the large stone oven, a young girl carefully shaped small pieces of dough into tiny birds. She couldn't have been older than 12. Her brown hair was tied neatly beneath a linen scarf. She looked up and smiled. Another traveler? The old baker nodded. I believe so. She brushed flour from her hands. I'm Clara. Ethan. She offered him one of the little bread birds. It's tradition. He looked surprised. For me, Clara giggled. For everyone who arrives hungry. Ethan accepted the warm little loaf. It was shaped like a bird with tiny wings spread wide. He took a small bite. The bread was soft, warm, perfectly simple. Yet somehow, it tasted like comfort itself. The old baker watched quietly. "My name is Alden," he said. "I've been the miller here for 43 harvests." Ethan looked toward the giant sails turning outside the window. They never seemed to stop. Alden smiled. The wind rests. The mill rests. But hope. He looked toward the fresh bread cooling upon the shelves. Must be baked every morning. Outside, the windmill continued turning beneath the endless sky. Its steady rhythm echoed softly through the valley. Round and round and round. Ethan had arrived expecting to find a place that made flour. Instead, he sensed he had found another place that quietly nourished hearts. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 2. The sack of worries no one could lift. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Hearthwind Mill and Bakery. Tiny specks of flour floated lazily through the warm golden light. Outside, the great wooden sails of the windmill turned with their calm, familiar rhythm. Round and round and round. Inside the bakery, the comforting scent of fresh bread wrapped around every corner. Clara carefully arranged warm loaves into neat wicker baskets. Each loaf looked slightly different. Some were round like little suns. Others were braided with delicate patterns. No two were exactly alike. Ethan watched with curiosity. "You don't try to make them identical?" Clara laughed softly. "Mr. Alden says people aren't identical, so bread shouldn't pretend to be." From across the room, Alden smiled without looking up from the dough he was kneading. "The best bread," he said, "always remembers the hands that made it." Just then, the bakery door creaked open. A middle-aged farmer stepped inside. His clothes were clean but worn. His shoulders drooped beneath the weight of a large burlap sack resting across his back. He looked exhausted. Alden greeted him warmly. "Good morning, Thomas." Thomas managed a tired smile. "Morning." Without another word, he lowered the heavy sack onto the wooden floor. Thud! The sound echoed through the bakery. Ethan glanced toward it. "That must be grain." Thomas shook his head slowly. "I wish it were." Clara quietly stopped arranging bread. No one laughed. No one looked surprised. Alden simply nodded. "I'll put the kettle on." While the tea warmed, Thomas sat silently near the stone oven. His eyes remained fixed on the heavy sack. After several quiet minutes, Ethan finally asked, "What's inside?" Thomas sighed deeply. "Worries." Ethan blinked. "Worries." The farmer gave a small smile. "My crops haven't grown well. My oldest son wants to leave the village. My roof leaks every time it rains. And I haven't slept properly in weeks." He gently patted the sack. "It feels heavier every morning." Ethan looked at the old burlap bag. It looked ordinary, yet somehow, the room itself felt heavier because it was there. Alden returned carrying 3 cups of warm tea. He handed one to Thomas, then quietly sat beside him. "Would you like to help me?" Alden asked. Thomas looked puzzled. "With what?" "The bread." Thomas hesitated. "I'm not much of a baker." "You don't need to be." Alden smiled. "You only need willing hands." Slowly, Thomas rolled up his sleeves. Together they carried fresh flour to the large wooden table. Alden poured warm water into the bowl, added salt, then handed the mixture to Thomas. Knead. At first, Thomas worked stiffly. His movements were slow, distracted. His thoughts clearly remained inside the heavy sack. But as the dough slowly came together, something changed. His breathing became steadier. His shoulders relaxed. The dough resisted, then softened, again and again, until it became smooth beneath his hands. Clara leaned toward Ethan and whispered, "Watch his face." Ethan did. The deep lines of worry had not disappeared, but they no longer seemed quite as sharp. After nearly half an hour, Thomas looked down at the finished dough. "I didn't think about my roof once," he admitted quietly. Alden smiled. "Sometimes, our hands remind our hearts that they don't have to carry everything alone." Thomas looked toward the sack resting near the door. "It still feels heavy." "Of course," Alden replied. "Worries don't disappear because we ignore them." He covered the dough with a clean linen cloth, but they become easier to carry after we've made something good. The farmer nodded thoughtfully. Before leaving, he lifted the burlap sack once again. His expression changed. "It's lighter," he whispered. Ethan looked surprised, but nothing came out of it. Thomas smiled for the first time that morning. "No, but something came out of me." The old farmer thanked Alden, thanked Clara, then even thanked Ethan. As he stepped outside, the wind caught the sails of the mill. Round and round and round, the steady rhythm echoed across the golden fields. Ethan watched Thomas disappear along the country path. He turned toward Alden. Did baking solve his problems? The old miller gently shook his head. No, it reminded him that he was stronger than them. Alden looked at the warm loaves cooling on the wooden shelves. "My father used to tell me, bread cannot remove tomorrow's burdens, but it can give people enough strength to face them with hope." Ethan looked around the peaceful bakery, the turning windmill, the warm oven, the smell of fresh bread, the flour-covered table. He began to understand. This place did not make worries disappear. It simply refused to let people carry them hungry. Outside, the wind continued its quiet work, and inside, hope rose gently, just like bread. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 3, The Bread That Rose Twice. The morning passed gently at Hearthwind Mill and Bakery. Warm sunlight streamed through the tall windows. Outside, the great windmill turned steadily above the golden fields. Round and round and round. Inside, the comforting rhythm of baking filled the air. The soft tap of wooden bowls. The whisper of flour falling onto the table. The gentle sound of dough being kneaded with patient hands. Ethan tied on a clean linen apron that Clara had found for him. She smiled mischievously. "Now you look like you belong here." Ethan laughed. "I'm not sure the bread would agree." Alden looked up from the mixing bowl. "The bread is kinder than people. It welcomes every pair of willing hands." Together, they prepared another batch of dough. Flour, warm water, salt, a little yeast. Nothing unusual. Yet Alden measured each ingredient with remarkable care. Not hurried, not delayed, simply attentive. Ethan noticed a small wooden bowl sitting alone on a nearby shelf. Unlike the others, it was beautifully carved with tiny wheat stalks circling its rim. "What is that bowl for?" Alden smiled softly. "My father's starter." Ethan tilted his head. The dough inside has been shared from one loaf to the next for over 50 years. Clara gently touched the edge of the bowl. Mr. Alden says every loaf carries a little memory from the ones before it. Ethan looked at the smooth mixture resting inside. So today's bread remembers yesterday? In a way, Alden replied, and tomorrow will remember today. He carefully added a small spoonful of the starter into the fresh dough, then covered the bowl with a linen cloth. We wait, he said. Minutes passed peacefully. The dough slowly began to rise. Softly, silently, almost invisibly, Ethan watched with fascination. It looks alive. Alden nodded. Hope often does. Just then, a hurried knock echoed through the bakery. A teenage boy stepped inside carrying a flattened loaf wrapped in cloth. His face was filled with disappointment. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "I tried baking bread for my grandmother." He unfolded the cloth. The loaf was dense, misshapen, hardly risen at all. "I followed the recipe." He sighed, "but it never grew." Clara smiled kindly. "It happens." The boy looked embarrassed. "I wanted it to be perfect." Alden gently picked up the loaf. He examined it carefully, then broke off a small piece. He tasted it. After a thoughtful moment, he smiled. "It's good." The boy blinked. "But it didn't rise." Alden nodded. "The bread didn't." He looked warmly at the young baker. "But you did." The bakery grew wonderfully quiet. The boy looked confused. "I don't understand." Alden placed the loaf on the wooden table. "You cared enough to try. You learned something. And tomorrow, you'll bake a better loaf." He smiled. "That is growth too." The young baker lowered his eyes. A small smile slowly appeared. Clara handed him another piece of fresh dough. "Let's make another one." This time, Ethan joined them. The four of them kneaded together, laughing whenever flour drifted onto someone's nose. The second loaf rested beneath its linen cloth. They waited patiently. Slowly, the dough began to rise. Higher, softer, fuller. The young baker watched with wide eyes. "It worked." Alden chuckled. "No, you worked." The bread simply followed. When the loaf emerged from the stone oven, its golden crust crackled softly as it cooled. The smell filled the bakery with warmth. The boy carefully held it in both hands. His eyes shone with quiet pride. Before leaving, he looked back at Alden. "I thought bread only needed flour." Alden smiled. "It also needs patience." He paused. "And so do people." After the boy disappeared down the country road, Ethan looked toward the first failed loaf still resting on the table. "What will happen to this one?" Alden sliced it into thick pieces. "We'll make toast," he said cheerfully. "Not every mistake must be thrown away. Sometimes, it simply becomes something different." Ethan smiled. The first loaf had not been useless. The second loaf had not been perfect. Yet together, they had taught the same lesson. Some things rise only once, but hearts, when encouraged with kindness, can rise again and again. Outside, the great windmill continued turning beneath the endless sky. Patiently, faithfully, just as it always had. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 4. The Flour That Covered Every Apron. The afternoon sun bathed Hearthwind Mill and bakery in a warm golden glow. Outside, the windmill's great wooden sails turned steadily against the blue sky. The wheat fields danced with every passing breeze. Inside the bakery, fresh loaves cooled upon wooden shelves. The comforting aroma of warm bread lingered in every corner. Ethan carefully swept flour from the long baking table. Clara stacked empty baskets beside the stone oven. Alden hummed a quiet tune as he measured another sack of freshly milled flour. Everything moved with peaceful rhythm until the front door swung open. One child stepped inside, then another, then 5 more. Within moments, nearly a dozen village children filled the bakery. Each wore a clean linen apron much too large for them. Some laughed, some whispered excitedly. One little boy sneezed the moment he smelled the flour. Everyone giggled. Clara smiled. It's Thursday. Ethan looked puzzled. What happens on Thursdays? Alden answered without looking up. We bake together. The children hurried to wash their hands. Soon each stood before a wooden mixing bowl. One carefully measured flour. Another poured warm water. Someone accidentally added far too much salt. Oh no, the little girl gasped. Instead of scolding her, Alden simply smiled. What shall we do? The children looked at one another. Finally, a small boy raised his hand. We can start again. Alden nodded proudly. Exactly. No lesson is wasted if it teaches us what to do next. Fresh flour was poured. New water added. Another beginning. This time, everyone worked more slowly, more carefully. Before long, soft dough rested beneath every pair of little hands. Flour drifted through the air like tiny white snowflakes. Soon, it wasn't only the children covered in flour. Clara's cheeks were dusted white. Ethan's sleeves looked pale as winter clouds. Even Alden's beard had become almost completely white. The children burst into laughter. You look like a snowman, one little girl told Alden. He laughed louder than anyone. I've looked this way every Thursday for 30 years. As the room filled with cheerful voices, Ethan noticed something beautiful. No one cared whose loaf looked best. Whenever one child struggled, another quietly stepped beside them. One boy helped tie an apron. Another showed a younger girl how to fold the dough gently instead of squeezing it. A little sister proudly carried water for everyone. No one had been asked to help. They simply did. After the dough had been left to rise, the children gathered around the old wooden table. Alden placed a small sack of flour in the center. This, he said softly, looks ordinary. It isn't. The children leaned closer. My grandfather told me, every grain of flour once stood alone in the field. Only after they came together could they become bread. The room grew quiet. Even the youngest children listened carefully. So remember, he smiled, no loaf is made from one grain, and no good life is built by one person alone. Just then, a loud clap of thunder echoed across the valley. The children glanced nervously toward the windows. Dark clouds rolled over the wheat fields. Rain began tapping softly against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. One little boy frowned. What if the rain ruins the harvest? Alden walked to the doorway. He watched the fields for a long moment, then smiled. The wheat has been asking for this rain all week. The children looked surprised. Not every dark cloud, he said gently, arrives to take something away. Sometimes it comes carrying exactly what we've been needing. The children smiled as the rain continued falling. Inside the bakery, the oven glowed warmly. The smell of rising bread filled the room. Outside, the thirsty fields drank deeply from the gentle storm. When the loaves were finally baked, each child received one to carry home. None were perfectly shaped. Some were a little rounder, some slightly taller. One leaned to the side. Another had a tiny crack across its crust. Yet every child smiled proudly as they waved goodbye and disappeared into the rainy afternoon. Ethan noticed something. Flowers still covered every apron hanging by the door. Small white handprints decorated the wooden table. Tiny footprints crossed the bakery floor. Clara reached for a broom. Alden gently stopped her. "Leave them until tomorrow." She smiled knowingly. "So the bakery remembers?" He nodded. "A place filled with learning should always carry a few joyful signs of it." Ethan looked around the warm little bakery. He realized flour washes away, aprons grow clean, footprints disappear, but the kindness shared while making something together can nourish hearts long after the bread is gone. Outside, the rain slowly faded, and above the golden fields, a rainbow quietly stretched across the evening sky. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 5, The Recipe That Had No Measurements. The rain had passed during the night. Morning sunlight spilled across the golden wheat fields like warm honey. Tiny drops of dew sparkled upon every stalk. The great sails of Hearthwind Mill turned steadily in the gentle breeze. Round and round and round. Inside the bakery, the air was wonderfully warm. The stone oven had already been glowing since before sunrise. Fresh loaves rested on cooling racks, filling the room with the comforting aroma of baked bread. Ethan noticed that yesterday's tiny flower handprints still decorated the long wooden table, just as Alden had promised. The bakery remembered. Clara carried a basket of warm rolls to the front counter. She smiled when she saw Ethan looking at the little white handprints. "They'll disappear by tomorrow," she said, "but I always wish they stayed a little longer." Before Ethan could answer, the front bell jingled softly. An elegant elderly woman stepped inside. She wore a neatly pressed blue dress and carried a small leather notebook tied with a ribbon. Alden's face brightened immediately. "Mrs. Eleanor." She smiled warmly. "I've come for your recipe." Clara laughed quietly. Again, Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "I've been trying for 20 years. Ethan looked puzzled. "You don't already have it?" The old woman held up her notebook. "Oh, I have every ingredient, every instruction, every baking time." She sighed playfully. "But my bread never tastes quite like Alden's." Alden chuckled. "I'm afraid that's because the most important part isn't written down." Mrs. Eleanor folded her arms. "That's exactly what you've said every year. And every year, you refuse to tell me." Alden walked to an old wooden drawer beneath the work table. From inside, he carefully removed a faded recipe card. Its edges had grown soft with age. The handwriting belonged to someone long ago. Ethan leaned closer. Flour, water, salt, yeast. Nothing unusual. Then, near the bottom, one final line had been written in smaller letters. There was no number beside it, no measurement. It simply said, "Patience until the dough is ready." Mrs. Eleanor smiled knowingly. There it is again, the impossible ingredient. Alden gently shook his head. "It's not impossible. It simply cannot be measured." Ethan looked at the recipe. "How do you know when there's enough patience?" The old miller smiled. "You stop watching the clock and start watching the dough." At that very moment, a young baker hurried into the shop carrying two bowls. I have a problem. One bowl held dough that had risen beautifully. The other remained flat. I made them at exactly the same time. He said, I followed every measurement perfectly. Alden looked at both bowls, then asked, were you worried while making this one? He pointed toward the flat dough. The young baker blinked. A little. My daughter has been ill. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Alden nodded gently. And this one? My wife finished kneading it. A small smile crossed the young man's face. She said, let's trust the bread for a little while. The old miller placed a hand on the worried baker's shoulder. Sometimes, our hands carry what our hearts are holding. The young man looked down at the dough in silence, then quietly smiled. I understand. Alden divided the flat dough into smaller pieces. He handed one piece to Ethan. Would you need this? Ethan nodded. Slowly, carefully, he folded the dough, pressed it gently, turned it, then repeated the movement again, not rushing, not forcing, only listening to the rhythm beneath his hands. The dough gradually softened. Its rough edges disappeared. Clara watched with a smile. You've learned. Ethan looked surprised. I'm still making mistakes. Clara nodded. So is everyone. But today, you're no longer afraid of them. After some time, the dough began rising quietly beneath its linen cloth. Not quickly, not dramatically, simply, steadily. Mrs. Eleanor laughed. I suppose patience has arrived again. Alden smiled warmly. It was here all along. Before leaving, Mrs. Eleanor carefully copied the final line of the recipe into her notebook. But this time, she added one sentence beneath it. The heart measures what the hands cannot. As the bakery grew peaceful once more, Ethan looked around the warm room, the turning windmill, the glowing oven, the bowls of rising dough. He realized the finest recipes in life often leave space for something no measuring cup can hold. Kindness, hope, faith, and patience. Outside, the wind carried the scent of ripening wheat across the valley. Inside, another loaf quietly rose, not because anyone hurried it, but because someone believed it would. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 6. The bread shared before it was sliced. The morning breeze drifted gently across the golden fields. The great sails of Hearthwind Mill turned with their familiar rhythm. Round and round and round. The steady creak of weathered wood echoed peacefully through the valley. Inside the bakery, the first loaves of the day had just come out of the stone oven. Their golden crusts crackled softly as they cooled. The warm aroma of fresh bread filled every corner. It was impossible to step inside without smiling. Ethan helped Clara arrange the loaves into wicker baskets. Some were destined for the village market. Some would be delivered to nearby farms. Others would quietly appear on the doorsteps of families who had fallen on difficult times. No one ever spoke about those deliveries. They simply happened, as though kindness preferred to travel quietly. Alden carefully lifted one particularly beautiful round loaf from the oven. Its crust shone like polished amber. Steam rose gently from its surface. Clara looked at it and smiled. That one is perfect. Alden nodded. It will be today's sharing loaf. Ethan tilted his head. Sharing loaf. Instead of answering, Alden carried the warm loaf outside. He placed it on a simple wooden table beneath an old oak tree beside the windmill. Soon, people began arriving from every direction. The village blacksmith, the shepherd, the schoolteacher, children on their way home from morning lessons, a traveling musician carrying an old flute, even Thomas, the farmer who had once brought his invisible sack of worries. Each person greeted the others with a warm smile. No invitations had been sent. No bells had been rung. Yet everyone seemed to know. Clara leaned toward Ethan. "It happens every Friday." "What happens?" "You'll see." The villagers gathered around the wooden table. The beautiful loaf rested quietly in the center. Still warm, still whole. Ethan noticed something unusual. There was no knife, no plates. No one reached for the bread. Everyone simply waited. Finally, a little girl looked up at all of it. "May we?" The old miller smiled. "You may," instead of slicing the loaf. The little girl gently tore off a small piece with her hands. She handed it to the oldest woman standing nearby. The elderly woman smiled gratefully. Then she tore off another piece and passed it to someone else. Piece by piece, the loaf traveled around the circle. No one took more than they needed. No one hurried. No one worried there wouldn't be enough. The bread became smaller. Yet somehow, the smiles around the table grew larger. Ethan accepted the final piece. He looked at the loaf. Almost nothing remained. Only a few crumbs rested upon the wooden board. "I thought someone would cut it," he said quietly. Alden shook his head. "When bread is sliced, everyone receives the same amount." He smiled gently. "But when bread is shared, everyone receives exactly what they need." The words settled softly into Ethan's heart. Just then, a weary traveler approached the bakery. Dust covered his boots. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He paused when he saw the empty board. "Oh," he whispered, "I must have arrived too late." Without hesitation, Thomas stepped forward. He broke his own piece of bread in half. The schoolteacher did the same. Then the shepherd. Then the blacksmith. One by one, everyone offered part of what they had already received. Within moments, the traveler held a full piece of warm bread in his hands. His eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "You've given me your own," he said softly. Thomas smiled. "It tastes better that way." The traveler took a bite. He closed his eyes for a moment. "I haven't eaten since yesterday." No one asked where he had come from. No one asked where he was going. For a little while, he simply belonged at the table. After everyone had finished eating, Clara gathered the remaining crumbs. Instead of throwing them away, she scattered them across the grass. Almost immediately, small sparrows fluttered down from the oak tree. They chirped happily as they enjoyed the tiny feast. Ethan smiled. Even the crumbs are shared. Alden looked toward the birds. "My grandmother always said, a loaf is never truly finished until every hungry heart has found its portion." The breeze gently turned the windmill sails once more. Round and round and round, Ethan watched the sparrows lift into the bright blue sky. He realized generosity is not measured by how much we keep. It is measured by how willingly we make room for one more person at the table. The old oak tree stood quietly beside the bakery. Its branches offered shade to everyone beneath them, asking nothing in return, much like the bread, much like kindness itself. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 7, The Empty Chair Beside the Oven. The afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the golden wheat fields. A soft breeze turned the great sails of Hearthwind Mill. Round and round and round, Their steady rhythm echoed like a quiet heartbeat throughout the valley. Inside the bakery, the stone oven still radiated comforting warmth. Most of the day's bread had already been delivered. Only the rich scent of fresh loaves lingered in the peaceful room. Ethan wiped the wooden table clean while Clara stacked empty baskets near the door. Everything felt calm, comfortable, like the bakery itself was breathing slowly after a busy morning. As Ethan carried a basket toward the oven, he noticed something he hadn't paid much attention to before. Beside the glowing stone hearth stood a single wooden chair. It was old. Its arms were polished smooth by countless years of use. Unlike the other chairs, no one ever sat in it. Not Clara, not the customers, not even Alden. The chair remained quietly empty. Every day, Ethan looked at it curiously. Who does that chair belong to? Clara smiled softly. It belongs to someone who isn't here. Before Ethan could ask another question, Alden gently placed another piece of firewood into the oven. The flames crackled warmly. Then he turned toward the empty chair. "My father," he said. The bakery became wonderfully quiet. Alden rested one hand upon the worn wooden backrest. "He built this bakery. He taught me how to knead dough, how to listen to the wind, and how to trust bread before it rises." His fingers gently traced the smooth grain of the wood. When he grew too old to bake, he still sat here every morning, watching, smiling, reminding me that good bread cannot be hurried. Clara added quietly, "I never met him, but somehow I still feel like I know him." Ethan looked at the empty chair again. It no longer seemed empty. It felt welcoming, as though love had quietly remained long after footsteps had faded. Just then, a young woman entered the bakery carrying a small wrapped loaf. Her eyes looked uncertain. "I hope I'm not disturbing anyone." Alden smiled warmly. "Never." She stepped closer to the chair. "My grandfather passed away last winter," she whispered. "He always bought bread here every Saturday." She gently placed the little loaf upon the empty seat. I thought, he might like to know I finally learned how to bake. Silence filled the room. Not sorrowful, peaceful. Alden nodded with quiet understanding. "I think he already does." The young woman smiled through grateful tears. After a few quiet moments, she picked up the loaf once more. "I'll share it with my family tonight." As she left, the bakery felt lighter, not because sadness had disappeared, but because it had been gently shared. Ethan sat beside the empty chair, not in it, beside it. He remembered all the people who had quietly shaped his own journey. The lighthouse keeper who taught him to shine for others. The violin maker who helped him hear silence. The clockmaker who showed him that meaningful moments matter more than busy hours. The carpenter who built homes where lonely hearts belong. Finn, the boat builder, who taught him that kindness always finds its way home. Every teacher had continued walking with him, even after their paths had parted. Alden noticed Ethan's thoughtful expression. "My father used to tell me something," he said softly. "The people who truly love us never completely leave the table. Part of them remains in every kindness we pass along." The words settled gently into Ethan's heart. Clara walked to the empty chair. She carefully brushed away a tiny dusting of flour from its seat. She smiled, as if he might stop by tomorrow. Alden chuckled warmly. Old habits are a beautiful kind of hope. Outside, the windmill continued its faithful turning. The wheat fields whispered beneath the evening breeze. Inside the bakery, the empty chair remained exactly where it had always been, not as a reminder of loss, but as a quiet celebration of love that had never truly gone away. Ethan realized some chairs remain empty, so that our hearts never forget who helped us become the people we are today. The oven glowed softly, the bread cooled peacefully, and somewhere within the comforting silence, gratitude quietly took its seat. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 8. The Wind That Carried Every Good Deed. A gentle evening breeze swept across the golden wheat fields. The tall stalks swayed together like waves upon a quiet sea. Above them, the great sails of Hearthwind Mill turned steadily beneath the fading blue sky. Round and round and round, each graceful turn seemed to greet the wind with quiet gratitude. Inside the bakery, the day's work was nearly finished. The last loaves rested on wooden shelves, cooling slowly. The warm stone oven still glowed with gentle heat. Clara carefully folded the clean linen cloths. Ethan swept the last traces of flour from the floor. Alden stood near the open window, his eyes following the breeze as it crossed the fields. "It will be a good night for the wind," he said softly. Ethan smiled. "Can you tell just by looking?" Alden nodded. "The wheat always whispers first." Just then, a tiny feather drifted through the open window. It floated lazily through the warm bakery before landing beside Ethan's boots. He picked it up, pure white, soft as morning clouds. It reminded him of snow, the white dove he had met many journeys ago. He tucked the feather gently into his journal. Some memories arrived without making a sound. As twilight settled over the valley, Alden picked up a large wicker basket. Inside were several warm loaves of bread. "Come," he said, "we have one last delivery." The three of them walked along a narrow path that wound between the wheat fields. The evening breeze followed them, carrying the sweet scent of fresh bread across the valley. After a short walk, they reached the top of a gentle hill. There stood an old stone bench beneath a lone oak tree. No houses, no barns, no shops, only the quiet hill overlooking the fields. Alden placed one warm loaf upon the bench, then stepped back. Ethan looked around. "Who's it for?" Alden smiled. "We never know." Before Ethan could ask another question, they quietly turned and walked away. They had gone only a short distance when Clara whispered, "Don't look back yet." So they didn't. They simply continued walking while the breeze played among the wheat. Several minutes later, Alden nodded. "Now." Ethan turned. Far away, a tired traveler had reached the hill. His clothes were dusty from the road. He paused when he noticed the fresh loaf resting on the stone bench. He looked around, seeing no one. He bowed his head with quiet gratitude, then carefully picked up the bread. For a long moment, he simply held it close. Before continuing his journey, Ethan smiled. He'll never know who left it. Alden nodded, and that's perfectly all right. The breeze carried the traveler's quiet footsteps into the distance. "My grandmother used to tell me," Alden said softly, "the wind carries more than seeds. It carries every unseen kindness. You may never know where it lands, but somewhere, someone is breathing easier because of it." They reached the bakery just as the first stars appeared above the valley. The windmill continued turning beneath the evening sky. Round and round and round. Ethan stood outside for a while, listening to the gentle wind. He thought about the lanterns on the river, the paper boats, the shared bread, the empty chair, the loaf left on the lonely hill. None of those acts had asked for applause. None expected to be remembered. Yet each one quietly changed someone's day. Perhaps that was how kindness traveled. Like the wind, invisible, gentle, always moving forward. Before going inside, Ethan noticed something carved into one of the old wooden beams supporting the windmill. The letters had faded with time, but they could still be read. Let every good deed travel farther than your name. He gently traced the carving with his fingertips, then smiled. The wind stirred once more, crossing the wheat fields, turning the great sails, carrying the scent of fresh bread far beyond the little bakery. Somewhere, someone would follow that comforting aroma home, and perhaps, without ever knowing why, believe the world had become just a little kinder. The windmill continued its faithful turning beneath the stars, not seeking recognition, only doing the quiet work it had been given. And Ethan realized the kindest hearts often resemble the wind. They leave gentle changes everywhere they pass, while asking nothing in return. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 9. The Loaf That Waited Until Midnight. Night settled gently over the Golden Valley. The stars shimmered above Hearthwind Mill like tiny lanterns scattered across the sky. The great wooden sails turned more slowly now. The evening wind had softened. Round, pause, round, pause. Inside the bakery, the last customers had long since gone home. The stone oven still glowed with fading warmth. Only a few loaves remained on the wooden shelves. Clara finished washing the last mixing bowl. Ethan swept a final dusting of flour into the corner. Alden quietly closed the shutters one by one. The bakery had almost gone to sleep. Almost. Ethan noticed something unusual. One beautiful round loaf still rested alone on the center table. It looked fresh, perfectly baked. No basket waited beside it. No cloth covered it. It simply remained there, patiently. Aren't we putting that away? Ethan asked. Alden looked at the loaf and smiled. No, it isn't finished waiting. Clara laughed softly. He says that every night. Ethan tilted his head. Waiting for who? The old miller shrugged gently. We never know. The grandfather clock on the wall ticked quietly. Hours passed. Outside, the village lights slowly disappeared one by one. Only the moon remained awake. Its silver light spilled through the bakery windows. The loaf remained untouched. Near midnight, a gentle knock echoed against the wooden door. 3 soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. Alden opened it without surprise. Standing outside was a young woman wrapped in a dark traveling cloak. Rain droplets clung to her sleeves. Behind her stood a small boy, fast asleep in her arms. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know it's very late. My wagon broke a wheel outside the valley. We've been walking for hours. She lowered her eyes. I don't have enough money until I reach the next town tomorrow. Before she could say another word, Alden simply smiled. I think your bread has been waiting. He lifted the warm, round loaf from the table and placed it gently into her hands. The woman blinked. You saved this. I hoped someone might need it. She looked down at the sleeping child. Tears quietly filled her eyes. He hasn't eaten since this morning. Clara quickly wrapped 2 warm rolls in a linen cloth. For breakfast, she said, The woman tried once more to offer a few coins. Alden gently closed her hand around them. "Keep them. You'll need them farther down the road." For a long moment, no one spoke. The quiet warmth of the bakery said everything words could not. The woman smiled through grateful tears. "I don't know how to repay you." Alden shook his head. "When your own table is full someday, leave room for someone else. That will be enough." She nodded. "I promise." Then she disappeared into the moonlit night, holding the sleeping child, holding the waiting loaf. The bakery became peaceful once again. Ethan looked at the now empty table. "You knew someone would come." Alden smiled. "No, I only knew. Someone always does." He carefully brushed a few remaining crumbs from the wooden tabletop. "My father never closed the bakery without one loaf left behind. Hope," he used to say, "should never lock its doors too early." The words lingered softly in the warm room. Outside, the wind turned the great sails one gentle circle beneath the stars. Round and round, the moonlight rested quietly upon the golden fields. Ethan looked toward the empty shelf. He realized the loaf had not been forgotten. It had been trusted. Sometimes, the greatest gift is not giving away what we no longer need. It is patiently saving something beautiful for the person we have not yet met. The stone oven slowly released its final warmth. The bakery settled into peaceful silence. And somewhere beyond the valley, a tired mother and her sleeping child shared a meal, prepared long before they even knew they would need it. The wind carried the comforting scent of fresh bread across the quiet countryside, as if reminding every traveler, there is always a place where hope is still waiting. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 10, The Flower That the Wind Returned. The first light of dawn spread gently across the valley. A pale golden glow touched the endless wheat fields. Morning dew shimmered upon every stalk like tiny crystals. The great sails of Hearthwind Mill greeted the new day with their familiar rhythm. Round and round and round, the cool breeze carried the scent of fresh earth and ripening grain. Inside the bakery, the stone oven was already warm. Clara tied her apron while humming a cheerful tune. Ethan filled wooden bowls with freshly milled flour. Alden quietly inspected sacks of grain stacked neatly against the wall. Everything seemed exactly as it always had, until a sudden gust of wind swept through the open doorway. Whoosh! The force of the breeze startled everyone. One open sack of flour tipped sideways. A soft white cloud burst into the air. Flour danced through the bakery like drifting snow. It covered the tables, the shelves, the floor. Even Ethan's hair turned completely white. Clara laughed so hard she had to hold her stomach. "You look older than Mr. Alden." Ethan brushed flour from his eyebrows. "I've aged 20 years in 1 second." Even Alden couldn't help laughing. For a few joyful moments, the entire bakery forgot about work. They simply laughed together. When the laughter faded, Ethan looked at the scattered flour. "I'm sorry. I should have closed the sack." Alden gently placed a hand on his shoulder. No harm was done. He knelt beside the spilled flour, carefully gathering what could still be used, what the wind carried away. He said softly, "We simply gather with patience." Just then, several village children arrived for their usual morning baking lesson. The moment they stepped inside, they froze. The entire bakery looked as though winter had arrived overnight. One little boy pointed at Ethan. "He's become a snow baker." The room filled with laughter once again. Instead of feeling embarrassed, Ethan laughed too. Sometimes, sharing a mistake makes it much lighter. Together, everyone began cleaning. Small brushes swept flour from the shelves. Cloths wiped the tables. The children carefully filled new sacks with the flour that remained clean. No one complained. No one hurried. It became another lesson, disguised as an accident. As they worked, a little girl frowned. So much flour was lost. Alden smiled. Was it? He pointed toward the windows. Outside, a flock of tiny sparrows had gathered beneath them. The wind had carried a fine dusting of flour onto the grass. The birds happily pecked at tiny seeds mixed within it. Nearby, several butterflies fluttered among wildflowers whose roots had been lightly covered by the rich powder. Even the breeze seemed gentler now, carrying the last traces across the nearby fields. Alden looked toward the children. My grandmother believed, the wind never steals. It only changes where gifts arrive. The children watched quietly. One little boy smiled. So even the birds had breakfast. Alden nodded. And perhaps the flowers did too. Later that afternoon, an elderly farmer stopped by the bakery. He carried a small cloth pouch. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Inside the pouch was fresh flour. "I found it on my porch this morning. The wind must have carried it there." Ethan laughed. So the wind brought some of it back. The farmer smiled. It seems kindness isn't the only thing that knows its way home. Alden accepted the pouch gratefully, then divided the flour into 3 smaller bags. One for the bakery, one for the farmer, and one for the village school. Clara smiled knowingly. "You never keep everything." The old miller shook his head gently. If blessings return, they often arrive looking for another journey. As the sun slowly drifted toward the western hills, the bakery sparkled once more. Every shelf stood clean. Every bowl rested neatly in its place. The windmill turned peacefully against the blue afternoon sky. Round and round and round, Ethan stood beside the open window. The breeze brushed gently across his face. He realized, not every unexpected gust arrives to ruin our plans. Sometimes, it scatters small gifts into places we never thought to reach. The flour had traveled farther than anyone intended, and somehow, the valley had become just a little richer because of it. The wind continued its quiet work, never asking permission, never asking for praise, simply carrying goodness, wherever it was needed most. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 11, The Bread That Remembered Every Hand. The morning sun climbed slowly above the rolling hills. Golden light poured across the endless wheat fields. The windmill greeted the day with its steady rhythm. Round and round and round. The gentle breeze carried the scent of ripened grain toward the little stone bakery. Inside Hearthwind Mill, the first dough of the morning rested beneath clean linen cloths. The stone oven glowed with comforting warmth. Everything felt peaceful, almost musical. Ethan noticed Alden carefully examining a fresh loaf that had just come out of the oven. Instead of placing it on the shelf, the old miller slowly turned it in his hands, as though he were admiring a treasured work of art. "What are you looking at?" Ethan asked. Alden smiled. "The fingerprints." Ethan blinked. "There aren't any fingerprints." Not anymore, Alden replied. But they're still there. Clara carried a basket of warm rolls to the counter. She laughed softly. Mr. Alden says every loaf remembers the hands that shaped it. Ethan looked curiously at the smooth golden crust. It looks the same as every other loaf. Alden gently shook his head. Look closer. He pointed toward the braided edge. The careful folds, the gentle pressure, the patience, the kindness. No two hands leave exactly the same story. Just then, the bakery door opened. A young father stepped inside, holding his little daughter by the hand. She couldn't have been older than 6. Behind them came her grandmother. The little girl proudly carried a tiny round loaf wrapped in a linen napkin. "We made it together," she announced. The grandmother smiled. 3 generations. My hands, my son's hands, and hers. She carefully unwrapped the bread. It wasn't perfect. One side leaned slightly. The crust had cracked near the top, but the little girl's eyes sparkled with pride. Alden accepted the loaf as though it were priceless. He broke off a small piece, tasted it, then smiled warmly. "This bread remembers 3 hearts." The little girl giggled. "It only remembers our hands." Alden knelt beside her. "And what do hands usually follow?" She thought for a moment. "Our hearts." He nodded. "Exactly." The family beamed with quiet joy. After they left, Ethan remained thoughtful. He picked up one of the bakery's fresh loaves. He remembered helping knead dough the day before. He could almost feel the familiar rhythm in his hands again. Fold, press, turn, repeat. Perhaps Alden was right. Maybe the bread truly did carry something invisible. Not fingerprints, but care. Later that afternoon, the village schoolteacher arrived carrying several drawings made by her students. Each picture showed the windmill, the bakery, or fresh bread shared around a table. One drawing caught Ethan's attention. It showed many colorful handprints surrounding a single loaf. Across the top, a child had carefully written, "Every hand helps the bread smile." Clara laughed with delight. "I love that." Alden quietly pinned the drawing beside the bakery door. "It belongs here." The teacher smiled. The children insisted. As evening approached, Alden prepared one final batch of dough. This time, he invited Ethan to knead it alone. At first, Ethan hesitated. "What if I make a mistake?" Alden smiled gently. "The dough already knows. You're trying your best." Slowly, Ethan placed both hands into the soft mixture. He folded, pressed, turned, again and again. He no longer worried about making everything perfect. Instead, he focused on making every movement gentle, every movement patient, every movement kind. When he finally stepped back, Alden nodded with quiet satisfaction. "That loaf will remember you." The words settled softly into Ethan's heart. Outside, the windmill continued turning beneath the glowing evening sky. Round and round and round, the wheat fields whispered peacefully beneath the breeze. Ethan looked toward the rising dough. He realized everything we create, whether bread, a friendship, a home, or even a single act of kindness, carries a little of the heart that shaped it. And perhaps, long after our hands have let go, the goodness we placed inside continues nourishing someone else's life. The bakery glowed warmly as the first evening stars appeared. Another loaf quietly rose, not only with flour and water, but with every gentle hand. that had lovingly helped bring it to life. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 12. The Last Crust on the Table. A quiet evening settled over Hearthwind Mill. The setting sun painted the golden wheat fields with shades of amber and bronze. The wind had grown gentler now. Even the great sails of the windmill turned more slowly, as though preparing for a peaceful night's rest. Round, pause, round, pause. Inside the bakery, the day's final customers had gone home. The stone oven still gave off a comforting warmth. Wooden shelves that had been filled with fresh bread that morning now stood almost empty. Only one small crust remained on the long oak table. It wasn't a full loaf, not even a slice, just the last golden crust from the day's baking. Ethan picked it up. He smiled. So this is all that's left. Clara glanced over from the sink where she was washing wooden bowls. She smiled too, not for long. Before Ethan could ask what she meant, a soft knock came at the door. A tiny gray cat slipped quietly inside. It wore no collar. Its fur looked slightly damp from the evening mist. Without a sound, it sat patiently near the doorway. Its bright green eyes looked toward the table. Alden noticed immediately. Our regular visitor, he said warmly. Ethan laughed. It comes every evening? Almost, Clara replied. And somehow, always at exactly the right moment. Alden took the small crust from Ethan's hand. Instead of placing it into the cat's bowl, he broke it into several tiny pieces, then set them gently outside beneath the old oak tree. The little cat followed him, but it didn't begin eating right away. Instead, it looked toward the branches above. Within moments, 3 tiny sparrows fluttered down, then another. The birds happily pecked at the smallest crumbs. Only after they had finished, the little gray cat quietly ate what remained. Ethan watched in amazement. It waited. Alden nodded. So did the bread. The old miller smiled as he leaned against the oak tree. My grandmother used to leave the last crust outside every evening. She said, if we believe only people become hungry, we haven't listened carefully enough to the world. The breeze gently rustled the wheat fields. The cat curled comfortably beneath the tree. The sparrows chirped softly before flying back into the branches. The last crust had found every place it was needed. As they returned inside, Clara began wiping the long wooden table. Soon, only a few tiny crumbs remained. She reached for the cloth, but Alden stopped her. Leave those until morning. Clara smiled knowingly. The mice. He nodded with a quiet grin. They work hard too. Ethan couldn't help laughing. So even the crumbs have a purpose. Alden chuckled. I've never met a gift too small to matter. A little later, as the stars appeared above the valley, a young shepherd stopped by the bakery. He carried a small basket of fresh apples. I heard today's bread is gone. He said, it is. Alden replied. The shepherd smiled. Then perhaps someone here would enjoy these. He placed the basket on the table. No charge. No reason. Just because. After he left, Ethan looked at the apples. It never really ends, does it? Alden gently shook his head. No. Kindness simply changes hands. He picked up one apple, then placed it beside tomorrow morning's flour. So breakfast already has its first gift. The windmill turned quietly beneath the moonlight. Round, pause, round, pause. Its wooden sails never hurried. Its steady rhythm seemed to whisper the same truth over and over again. Nothing meaningful is ever truly wasted. Not the final loaf, not the smallest crumb, not the quietest act of generosity. Ethan stood beside the open window. He watched the stars shining above the peaceful fields. He realized sometimes the greatest lesson isn't found in the first slice of bread. Sometimes it's waiting patiently inside the very last crust left on the table, because even the smallest piece, shared with love, can still nourish more hearts than we ever imagined. The warm bakery slowly grew quiet. Tomorrow, fresh dough would rise again. New loaves would fill the shelves, and another simple day would become another beautiful lesson. To be continued. Episode 15, The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 13, The Windmill That Never Counted Its Turns. The morning sky stretched clear and blue above the valley. Golden sunlight poured across the endless wheat fields. A cool breeze awakened the tall stalks, and they swayed together like a sea of gold. Above them, the great sails of Hearthwind Mill began their faithful dance once again. Round and round and round. Steady, patient, unhurried. Ethan stood outside the bakery, watching the windmill. For days now, he had listened to its gentle rhythm. Morning after morning, evening after evening. It never seemed to complain. It never hurried. And it never stopped simply because no one was watching. Alden stepped beside him, carrying 2 warm mugs of barley tea. "You've been studying the windmill," he said with a smile. Ethan accepted the cup. "I've been wondering something." "What is it? How many times has it turned?" Alden chuckled. "I have no idea." Ethan looked surprised. "You've lived here for more than 40 years. You've never counted?" The old miller looked up at the slowly turning sails. "My father never counted. My grandfather never counted. And neither do I." "But why?" Alden smiled gently. "Because the windmill isn't trying to break a record. It simply does the work it was built to do." The words lingered in the fresh morning air. Just then, a young apprentice named Noah hurried toward the mill. His arms were full of notebooks. His face looked troubled. "Mr. Alden, I've been keeping records." He spread several pages across the wooden table. "How many sacks of flour we milled? How many loaves we baked? How many customers came this month?" He sighed. "But I still don't feel like I've done enough." Alden studied the pages carefully. The numbers were neat, precise. Every detail had been recorded. Finally, the old miller folded the notebook closed. "Come with me." Together, they climbed the narrow wooden staircase inside the windmill. Higher and higher, until they reached the room where the great gears slowly turned. The sound was deep and steady. Clack, turn, clack, turn. Sunlight slipped through small windows, painting moving patterns across the ancient beams. Alden rested his hand on one of the massive wooden gears. "Noah, tell me, how many times has this gear turned since sunrise?" The apprentice hesitated. "I don't know." Alden nodded. "Does the flour care?" Noah smiled faintly. "No." "Do the families who eat today's bread care?" "No. They're simply thankful there's bread." The old miller looked warmly at his apprentice. "Good work doesn't become meaningful because it's counted. It becomes meaningful because it helps someone." The apprentice lowered his eyes thoughtfully. The notebook suddenly felt much lighter in his hands. As they walked back downstairs, Clara had gathered several village children outside. Each child held a small pinwheel made from colorful paper. The breeze caught them all at once. Blue, red, yellow, green. Every little pinwheel spun happily. Not one of the children tried to count the turns. They simply laughed. Ethan watched them with a smile. Perhaps joy wasn't something people measured. Perhaps it was something they experienced. Later that afternoon, an elderly traveler stopped beside the windmill. He quietly watched the great sails turning. Then he asked Alden, "Does it ever grow tired?" The old miller looked toward the endless sky. Sometimes the wind rests. Sometimes the mill rests. But purpose, he smiled gently, always wakes with the morning. Before continuing his journey, the traveler carefully carved a single sentence into the village guest book. The happiest wheels are the ones too busy helping to count their own turning. That evening, Ethan stood once more beneath the windmill. The great sails continued their faithful circles against the golden sunset. Round and round and round, he realized many beautiful things in life never stop to measure themselves. The sun never counts how many mornings it has risen. The river never counts how many boats it has carried. The wind never counts how many fields it has crossed. And kindness never asks how many hearts it has touched. It simply keeps moving, quietly, faithfully, one gentle turn at a time. The windmill stood proudly beneath the evening sky, not because it had turned the most, but because, with every single turn, it had quietly made life a little better for someone else. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 14. The bread that carried tomorrow's hope. The golden sun slowly drifted toward the western hills. Long shadows stretched across the endless wheat fields. The evening breeze turned the great sails of Hearthwind Mill with quiet grace. Round and round and round, the gentle rhythm echoed through the valley like a peaceful heartbeat. Inside the bakery, fresh loaves rested upon wooden shelves, their warm crusts still crackling softly. The comforting aroma of baked bread filled every corner. Clara carefully wrapped several loaves in clean linen cloths. Ethan noticed something unusual. Instead of placing them in the display baskets, she packed them into sturdy travel satchels. "Are we expecting visitors?" he asked. Clara smiled. "No, we're visiting them." Just then, Alden entered carrying a simple wooden wagon. It wasn't large, only big enough to hold a dozen loaves. A small lantern hung from one corner. "We have an evening delivery," he said. The three of them set out together along a winding country road. The sky slowly changed from gold to shades of soft lavender. The wheat whispered gently in the evening wind. Before long, the village disappeared behind them. Ahead, a small cluster of cottages rested at the edge of the valley. Some roofs needed repair. A few fences leaned with age. Yet flowers still bloomed beside every doorstep. Hope had found its place there too. At the first cottage, Alden quietly placed a loaf inside a wooden basket hanging beside the door. He didn't knock. He simply smiled and continued walking. Ethan looked puzzled. They won't know who left it. Alden nodded. That's the idea. At the second cottage, Clara tucked a warm loaf beside a bottle of fresh milk. On the third porch, Ethan carefully placed 2 small rolls next to a child's pair of tiny boots. The lantern's soft glow illuminated the simple gifts. No notes, no names, only bread. As they reached the final cottage, the door slowly opened. An elderly woman stepped outside wrapped in a wool shawl. She looked surprised to see them. "I thought the basket had fallen," she said with a gentle laugh. Then she noticed the fresh loaf. Her eyes sparkled. "I was just wondering what we would have for breakfast." Alden smiled warmly. "I believe tomorrow has already arrived." The woman held the loaf carefully against her heart. "My grandson visits in the morning," she whispered. "He loves warm bread." Clara quietly handed her an extra roll. "For him." The old woman smiled with grateful tears. "I don't know how to thank you." Alden gently shook his head. "Tomorrow, when someone else needs kindness, pass a little of it forward." The woman nodded. "I always do." As they walked back beneath the evening sky, Ethan noticed the nearly empty wagon. "There isn't much left." Alden smiled. "There was never meant to be." The stars slowly appeared overhead, one by one. The lantern beside the wagon glowed softly along the quiet road. After a while, Ethan asked, "Why deliver bread at night?" The old miller looked toward the distant cottages. "So people wake up with hope waiting for them." The words settled gently into the peaceful silence. When they returned to Hearthwind Mill, only one loaf remained inside the wagon. Alden carried it into the bakery. Instead of placing it on the shelf, he wrapped it carefully in clean linen, then set it beside tomorrow morning's flour. Ethan looked curious. "Who's that one for?" Alden smiled. "We don't know yet, but someone will need tomorrow what we're preparing today." The windmill turned quietly beneath the starlit sky, round and round and round. Its steady motion never hurried tomorrow. It simply prepared for it. Ethan stood outside beneath the stars. He realized hope rarely arrives at the very moment we ask for it. More often, someone has quietly been preparing it long before we ever knew we would need it. Just like the bread, just like kindness, just like tomorrow itself. The gentle breeze carried the scent of warm wheat across the sleeping valley. And somewhere, a family would wake with grateful smiles, never knowing that hope had been resting quietly on their doorstep all night. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 15. The Loaf That Was Never Sold. The first rays of dawn slipped gently across the valley. Golden light awakened the endless fields of wheat. Tiny drops of dew sparkled like scattered pearls upon every stalk. Above the quiet bakery, the great sails of Hearthwind Mill welcomed another beautiful morning. Round and round and round, their steady turning had become as familiar as breathing itself. Inside, the stone oven glowed warmly. Fresh dough rested beneath clean linen cloths. Clara was already humming softly as she arranged baskets along the wooden shelves. Ethan helped Alden shape the first loaves of the day. Each loaf received the same gentle care, the same patient hands, the same quiet attention. When the final loaf had been placed into the oven, Alden reached for one small round loaf resting on a separate wooden board. Unlike the others, it wore a tiny blue ribbon tied around its cloth wrapping. Ethan had noticed it before. Every morning, it was baked. Every evening, it was still there. "Does no one buy that loaf?" he finally asked. Alden smiled. "It isn't for sale." Clara looked toward the ribboned loaf and smiled knowingly. "It's never been for sale." Just then, the bakery door opened. A wealthy merchant stepped inside. His fine coat was embroidered with silver thread. A leather purse hung heavily from his belt. The rich aroma of fresh bread filled the room. His eyes immediately settled on the blue ribbon loaf. "I'll take that one," he said confidently. "I'll pay double." Alden gently shook his head. "I'm sorry. That loaf already belongs to someone." The merchant looked around the empty bakery. "I don't see anyone waiting." Alden smiled. "Neither do I, but someone will." The merchant frowned. "I'll pay 10 times the price." The old miller folded his flour-covered hands. "There are some gifts. Money should never interrupt." For a long moment, the merchant stood silently. Then, something softened in his expression. Instead of arguing, he quietly purchased 2 ordinary loaves. As he prepared to leave, he paused beside Ethan. "I've spent most of my life believing everything has a price." He glanced once more at the blue ribbon. "Perhaps some things become valuable because they don't." With a respectful nod, he continued on his journey. The bakery grew peaceful once again. Hours passed. The morning customers came and went. Children laughed outside the windmill. The wheat fields danced beneath the gentle breeze. Still, the ribbon loaf remained untouched. Late that afternoon, a knock echoed softly against the door. A young woman stepped inside, carrying a sleeping baby wrapped in a faded blanket. She looked exhausted, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "My husband was injured at the mill in the next valley. We've been traveling since yesterday. I don't have enough to buy bread." Before she could finish, Alden carefully lifted the blue ribbon loaf. He untied the ribbon, then placed the warm bread gently into her hands. "I believe this has been waiting for you." The young mother's eyes filled with tears. "You knew?" The old miller smiled. "No, I simply trusted that someone would need it." She held the loaf close, as though it were the safest thing in the world. "I'll never forget this," she whispered. Alden nodded gently. "When life becomes kinder to you, leave a little kindness waiting for someone else." She smiled through grateful tears. "I promise." As she quietly disappeared down the country road, the blue ribbon remained on the bakery table. Clara carefully folded it, then placed it beside tomorrow morning's flour. Ethan looked at her. "You saved the ribbon." She smiled. "We'll need it again." Outside, the windmill continued turning beneath the golden evening sky. Round and round and round. The breeze carried the scent of fresh bread across the valley. Ethan watched the young mother grow smaller in the distance. The loaf had finally reached the person it had been baked for. Not because anyone knew who she was, but because someone believed. Someone would eventually need hope. The old miller quietly swept a few crumbs from the table. Then he looked toward Ethan. "My father once told me, never bake only for today's customers. Always prepare one loaf for tomorrow's miracle." The words settled gently into Ethan's heart. He realized faith isn't always loud. Sometimes, faith is simply setting aside something precious for a stranger you haven't met yet. The evening breeze whispered through the wheat. The bakery windows glowed warmly, and beside tomorrow's fresh flour, the little blue ribbon waited patiently, ready to wrap another loaf, ready to carry another quiet miracle. To be continued. Episode 15. The Miller Who Turned Worries into Bread. Part 16. Finale. The bread that never truly ended. Dawn arrived gently over the valley. Golden sunlight spread across the endless wheat fields like a warm blanket. Tiny drops of dew shimmered upon every stalk. The great sails of Hearthwind Mill greeted the new day with their faithful rhythm. Round and round and round, the peaceful sound echoed through the quiet countryside. Inside the bakery, the stone oven glowed with its familiar warmth. Fresh dough rested beneath clean linen cloths. The scent of newly baked bread wrapped itself around every corner. Everything felt wonderfully ordinary, and somehow wonderfully extraordinary. Ethan stood beside the long wooden table where he had learned so many lessons. He looked around slowly. The flour-covered shelves, the woven baskets, the worn rolling pins, the empty chair beside the oven, the little blue ribbon waiting beside tomorrow's flour. Each object carried a story. Each story carried a lesson. Alden walked quietly toward the center of the bakery. In his hands rested a simple round loaf. Still warm, still fragrant, still waiting. He smiled at Ethan. "I think it's time." Ethan looked puzzled. "Time for what?" The old miller gently placed the loaf into Ethan's hands. "For you." Ethan blinked. "I didn't bake this." Alden chuckled softly. "No, but you helped make everything that led to it." The words settled gently into the quiet room. Clara stepped forward carrying a small linen cloth. She carefully wrapped the loaf, then tied the familiar blue ribbon around it. "This ribbon has traveled farther than any of us," she whispered, "and now it continues with you." Ethan held the loaf carefully. It felt warm, alive somehow, not because of the bread itself, but because of everything it represented. Just then, the village bell rang softly in the distance. People slowly began gathering outside the bakery. The farmer, the schoolteacher, the children, the shepherd, the blacksmith, the elderly woman, the traveling musician, even the young baker who had once believed his first loaf had failed. They all stood together beneath the turning windmill. No invitations had been sent, yet somehow everyone had come. Alden carried one final basket outside. Inside were dozens of warm rolls. He looked around the smiling crowd, then quietly said, "My father once believed that every loaf has only one purpose." Everyone listened, to become part of someone else's story. Silence followed, not empty silence, grateful silence. The villagers shared the bread together, just as they always had. Children laughed, neighbors embraced, travelers found a place at the table. No one asked who deserved the most. No one counted how much remained. The bread simply moved from hand to hand, exactly as kindness always does. When the last piece had been shared, only a few crumbs rested upon the wooden board. A small sparrow fluttered down beneath the oak tree. Then another. Soon the crumbs had become breakfast once again. Ethan smiled. Even the ending was another beginning. As the morning breeze strengthened, the great sails of the windmill turned proudly against the brilliant blue sky. Round and round and round. Alden looked toward Ethan. "What have you learned?" Ethan gazed across the valley. He thought about every lesson. The sack of worries, the bread that rose twice, the flour-covered aprons, the recipe without measurements, the shared loaf, the empty chair, the waiting bread, the faithful wind, the last crust, the windmill that never counted, the loaf prepared for tomorrow, the bread never sold. He smiled quietly. "I thought bread was something people ate," he said, "but now I know. It's something people become." Alden's eyes shone with gentle pride. "And what does good bread become?" Ethan looked toward the smiling faces gathered beneath the oak tree. It becomes hope. It becomes generosity. It becomes patience. It becomes home. The old miller nodded. Exactly. For a long while, no one spoke. The wind said enough. The wheat whispered softly. The children laughed. The birds sang from the branches above. Everything beautiful continued exactly as it always had. Ethan picked up his travel bag. The blue-ribboned loaf rested safely inside. It was time for another journey. Another village. Another teacher. Another lesson waiting somewhere beyond the hills. Before leaving, he turned toward Alden. Will I ever come back? The old miller smiled. You never truly leave. He gently placed a flower-covered hand on Ethan's shoulder. Wherever people share hope, a little piece of this bakery goes with them. Ethan nodded, then began walking along the quiet country road. The morning sun lit his path. Behind him, the windmill continued turning. The bakery doors remained open. Fresh bread continued rising. New travelers continued arriving. Kindness continued finding new hands. Some stories end. Others simply keep feeding the world. And somewhere beyond the hills, another weary heart was already walking toward a lesson it did not yet know it needed. The wind carried the warm scent of bread far across the countryside, a quiet reminder that the simplest gifts, offered with love, can nourish generations. And so, the little bakery beside the turning windmill continued its gentle work. One loaf, one smile, one hopeful heart at a time. The end. Full sleep stories on Golden Haven. Subscribe for peaceful nights.